And don't worry, Paul, I think, might say, about the governing authorities and rulers. They will have their day in God's courtroom where they will finally realize that they aren't as powerful as they thought, but rather recognize that your conduct must be above reproach, that they will have no reason to use their sword against you. And by the way, if they do, if you have done nothing wrong and they extend the sword, oh yeah, they have gone beyond the reach of their God-given place.
Welcome to Theology Curator, a podcast hosted by Kurt Willems and available online at theologycurator.com. Each episode looks at a theological, formational, or cultural theme. We might dig into the life and letters of a radical Jewish teacher named Paul, converse about a pressing contemporary issue, reflect on the nature of following Jesus today, or even attempt to remedy doom and gloom preaching with a good old-fashioned dose of hope. This show is an invitation to build bridges between the first century world of the earliest Christ followers into the 21st century reality we now inhabit. The Jesus we excavate from the rubble of tradition might just surprise us all.
I want to welcome you back to Theology Curator. My name is Kurt Willems. I'm a writer and I do this podcast. And I try to just be as helpful as possible. The reason we call this Theology Curator, it's based on my website and email newsletter that goes out occasionally, is that I have for many years tried to be someone who curates or brings together the most helpful resources that I come across, and also to give you ideas that I come across. And so that's what I want to do today. And today I'm going to center on one particular passage of scripture that is used all kinds of different ways. And usually when it's used in a sort of reaction space or by a public official, it is used in a way that is outright unbiblical. And that is Romans 13. Romans 13, yeah. So Romans 13 is a very challenging passage. And so my goal today is a couple of things. First thing I want to say is that I want to talk about the various ways that I think Romans 13 is applied poorly. The second thing I want to do is I want to talk about why Romans 13 matters right now. And then the third thing I'm going to do is try and unpack various scholarly approaches to this passage and hopefully kind of just leave us with ascending from there. So let's jump in and talk about what is wrong with some of the postures and approaches of this text. Romans 13 has often been used in a way to, with air quotes, I suppose I can say, keep people in line. And that's just horrendous because you have to understand that in the biblical world, the first century Roman reality, it makes zero sense to use this passage as a tool for oppressors towards oppressed people. When Paul wrote Romans 13, we have to understand that there is a empire that is being expanded by the day, by the moment, right? It started, under Augustus in a lot of ways. And at this point in history, we believe that Nero is likely on the throne of Rome. So what do we know about Nero? We know that Nero killed family members that he believed were moving against him. Of course, he is known for the Great Fire of Rome that happens, I believe, sometime in the early 60s, where basically Rome is starting to burn. There's that old saying about Nero playing his fiddle while Rome burns or something like that, because it's a historically documented event. And there's this idea back then that Christians were part of the scapegoat. Tacitus, one historian, talks about this, that basically Nero uses Christians and other minority groups as the blame for this and does horrendous things to the local Roman Christian population at the time. So if you have that as your backstory, if that's sort of like if Nero or any of the other emperors, they're all really not great dudes. Let's just be really honest about that. If that is your governmental structure, And if Paul is in fact talking about governmental structures in Romans 13, then you have to start asking, so is Paul down with what they do? So hold that thought, and I want to read to you Romans 13, just some of the relevant parts of it, and we can continue on this track a little bit. Verse 1 begins this way. It says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you wish to have no fear of the authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive its approval. For it is God's servant for your good. But if you do what is wrong, you should be afraid, for the authority does not bear the sword in vain. It is the servant of God to execute wrath on the wrongdoer." We'll stop there at what verse are we at? Verse 5 is about to start. So that's the New Revised Standard Version. And there's a lot there, right? We could talk about who are these governing authorities. We could talk about what is Paul getting at when it comes to resisting authority. Is that when can we resist? Or is he basically saying, no resisting? And there's a lot of other things. But really, what this passage has been used to do is to say, look, every government, every structure has been put in place by God because God is sovereign. And so do good things and live under the sovereign authority because the person who's in charge has been put there by God. That's the way this passage often is read. It also can be read as, hey, so therefore you have to follow every law. You have to do all of the things that the law, not the Jewish law here, but the law of the land say to do. In fact, a couple of verses later, verse 6, it says, "For the same reason, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants, busy with this very thing. Pay to all what is due them. Taxes to whom taxes are due, revenue to whom revenue is due, respect to whom respect is due, honor to whom honor is due." And it keeps going. I want to make sure we get the whole context. Verse 8, "Owe no one anything except to love one another, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law." That is a huge set of statements. And so if you're reading this and you live in an era where slavery is common practice, for instance, in the South, and your so-called master is using this text to keep slaves in line, oh my gosh, right? If someone believes that the Bible is sacred, well, of course, you would say, oh, then I better not be mischievous. I better not incur the wrath of my master because I need to be a quiet and in service kind of person, right? This is used for tyrannical governments. Think about the Nazis. And this is a text that for sure was used during the Nazi regime, being quiet and respectable and non-confrontational to the Nazis was a posture that some Christians took. I mean, it's absolutely horrendous when we think about it. But it's really interesting, too, because not only is this passage thrown around when there's tyrannical government and people wanting to keep other people under control, so to speak, but it's often put out there when there is a political cause and people want other people to fall into line and just, be quiet or stop complaining or whatever. I mean, one of the things that I think about even right now is the conversation around race. What is not good is when Romans 13 is appealed to stop protesting, for instance. How can you get there? Well, if you read this with a very narrow lens that says God put governing authorities in place, therefore fall into line and don't disrupt things. If that's how you read this passage, of course, yeah, you could apply it that way. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to suggest that there are very real alternatives to that sort of extracted, non-contextual reading of Romans 13. So let's dig in a little bit further. In a culture where your meme versus my meme, your pithy statement versus my pithy statement, in a social media driven debate kind of world, there is no doubt in my mind, absolutely none, that this passage continues to be used poorly. And some of the back reflections of how I've seen it used poorly, whether historically or even now, really informs what I want to talk about for a second. Why does this matter? Well, friends, if you are listening to this in somewhat real time, it is the beginning of June 2020. And what has been happening in our country has been challenging, to say the least. It started out with perpetual stay-at-home orders because of COVID-19. And this is still a very real concern. I mean, this is a big deal. COVID-19 didn't magically disappear as the news cycle has shifted. It's actually a very real lived reality that many people are having to still deal with, as some states are opening up, some have not quite opened up, depending on where you live. I live in King County, which is where Seattle, Washington is situated. And our county has not really done much to lift restrictions yet. We have a four-phase plan, and we're getting there. So life is pretty much still COVID-19 land out here. And so many people have died. It's very terrible. And as that was happening, of course, there was an impulse to say, for some people, we don't agree with this policy. We think we should be able to defy the government and tell them who's boss, because it's all conspiracy or whatever the motivation might have been. And I understand there's a complex conversation to be had. I tend to trust medical professionals and want to take their advice seriously. I tend to trust scientific research and want to take that very seriously. And so I tend to just say, okay, yeah, if this is a way to love my neighbor by keeping social distance for a season, then I'm willing to do that. What I noticed, though, there are quite a few people who have a different approach, and I'm not even trying to single them out or say, you're bad, I'm good. I'm simply just making an observation that for some people, there is an impulse to say in situations like that, you know what? We don't have to listen to you. We don't have to listen to the government. They're working for us or whatever, right? So there is this impulse to say that you can't tell me to stay home. That's a infringement on my rights or my freedom. So we're going to defy this order. And so we saw a wave of some rallies and some clear defiance of everything from, even little things like wearing a mask, which is been said to be helpful in reducing the possible spread of the virus if you happen to cough or sneeze, because it holds some of that back. It's little things in my mind, but for some people, they were big things. And I can only imagine how often Romans 13 did or didn't come up in this conversation, depending on what side of that you land on. Do we obey the governmental authorities or do we not? Right? So that is the first layer of this. And then now, beyond all the pain and suffering and over 100,000 deaths in the United States during these months already, just because of complications from COVID-19. Now, we've had video of at least 2 different African-American men who have been killed by white people. One was killed by a former, as I understand it, a former police officer or someone in law enforcement and his son, and another killed by a police officer in Minneapolis in broad daylight. Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, 2 image bearers of God who are no longer with us because of a system of racial injustice that is stacked against people of color in this country. That, my friends, is so heartbreaking. And of course, I think right now it's day 6 or so of ongoing protesting happening by way of folks who are done with a system that perpetuates the death of Black men and the suffering of many marginalized communities. They are done with feeling like they have to fall into line or have a less than approach to their own identity. And you know what? I'm done with that too. I don't want to be a part of a system that perpetuates racial injustice. I just don't want to be a part of that. And as a follower of Jesus, Jesus invites us to dismantle racial bias and to dismantle things that keep people away from the table. I mean, Jew and Gentile belong together. This is the central image of the New Testament when it comes to what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Jew and Gentile belong together. And the only way they get together, by the way, is if those with more privilege are willing to lay some of that down and elevate those with less privilege. You can't come to the table and sit at it. I mean, I imagine a picture where one person is given a chair very low to the ground and another person is sitting on a throne, and they're both supposed to eat at the same table. This will not work for all kinds of reasons. This is the world, however, that so many people experience. Persons of color every day are part of a system that has 400 years of backstory, that has been about segregation, has been about enslavement, has been about perpetuating a situation where folks were not given the same starting point that many in the white community have. And now, let's be honest and clear. What I am not saying, because I don't know where you're at in this journey, I am not saying that white privilege is the only sort of either benefit or barrier depending on your situation, right? So you can be someone who is white and have a very hard life, but it's not because of your whiteness, most likely, at least not at the structural level. Your whiteness actually is most often helpful because most white people have a different kind of network around them, support network and beyond, which includes various resources that for someone, for instance, who is white and in poverty may have situations and resources that make it easier to get out of poverty. That doesn't mean poverty isn't a limitation. It doesn't mean struggle and pain aren't real. It just means being white isn't part of why you have that struggle. And so two people who are equally poor, equally disadvantaged when it comes to economics may actually not have an equal chance of helping themselves out of that economic situation because there are systems and structures that make things harder if you are not white in this country. So that is something that I think is just real. And so there are these protests happening. And now it's like, well, we want to throw Romans 13 in there. And oddly, a lot of the people who were not protest necessarily, but kind of had this sense that this COVID-19 is dumb and, you know, the approach of the government here is dumb, are the same people, often, not always, who are saying, hey, we need to listen to Romans 13 during all of these protests because it's getting crazy. And so they need to be put into line. Stop doing this. Just obey the system as it is. And I can understand where some of that comes from. I mean, you're seeing video of people's property being destroyed, and there are people in law enforcement who are really putting their lives on the line, and some are losing their life. As I understand it, I mean, there's challenges that I empathize with in a huge way. I don't believe that destroying property is good. I don't believe that the death of anyone is good. But with that said, we have to also understand that when a society finds themselves in a place where certain people are treated less than other people, eventually the people at the bottom who have been pushed down are going to try and explode out of that situation. And sometimes that sort of, I don't know if this is a great metaphor, but that explosion out of that situation is actually going to be a little bit more retributive than we want. But here's what's beautiful. There is a much larger group of people who are standing up nonviolently saying something's got to change. Something's got to change. And so throwing Romans 13 at them is not biblically helpful and honestly not practically helpful. And so I thought I would just sort of move into a conversation about what do we do with Romans 13 then? Because everyone wants to use it when it's convenient for them. But really, I want to say this passage is not meant to be convenient for anybody. It's actually much more nuanced than that. And so hopefully I've given you a bit of, why I think it's used wrongly. And now, some of why I think it matters that we talk about it. We want to use the Bible well. We also want to make sure that we are being self-evaluating. The greatest way to honor the Bible is to be willing to enter the story of the Bible, its context, its world, all the things going on around the Bible. Like we didn't get a Bible from the sky that just fell down and here's all the right things you need to know. This is a product of a very intense cultural moment. I mean, it's not unlike the many cultural tensions we face today. And so why don't we do our best to honor this Bible and allow it to then convict us where we're wrong and not use it as a prop or a meme or a tool to get what we want out of the world? It reminds me that there's reports about Donald Trump dispersing a crowd with various sorts of smoke or tear gas. I'm not exactly sure which one has been confirmed, and possibly rubber bullets, but explosions to disperse a crowd so he could go to the church down the block and take a picture with a Bible. Right? I mean, it's a prop for so many people. It's, he has a Bible, we trust him kind of thing. I'm just done with that. I'm done with using the Bible for the aims of empire. I'm just done with that. And so what are we going to do? We're going to try and wrestle with what is Romans 13 actually trying to do in its world. And I want to step into that. And so if you're interested in that, that's where we're going to be for the rest of this program. The idea of submitting to the governing authorities continues to be an area of significant debate, even in the study of Paul. So to be very clear, no one really has a handle on how to use this passage the right way. We try to use it well, and we try to understand it within the larger flow of Romans as a whole. But at the end of the day, we have to continue to do hard work around this. But I might find it kind of fun, and maybe you will as well, to sort of just look in tidbit views at some of the scholars who were doing work around Romans 13 and their sort of take on it. And unfortunately, in a format like this, I'm only going to be able to do sort of like quick blurbs on each approach rather than really going deep. But here's what I want to say, that several scholars have taken very helpful steps to bring Romans 13, 1 through 7 specifically, into the flow of what Paul is up to. And by the way, one of the approaches has been historically that some scholars just say, it can't possibly be Paul. This is too out of line with his sort of push against empire, his push against sort of the Roman regime, even if it's subversively undertoning his language, so to speak, it just doesn't fit. And yeah, there's a few people who have taken that approach historically, but most scholars are like, nah, it still feels very much like Paul, even though it's hard. And I take that approach. I believe this is definitely Paul. And so what do we do with that? The first scholar we can bring up is N.T. Wright, who, for instance, highlights the way that chapter 13 connects to the prohibition against taking private vengeance against people back in chapter 12. And you can go read that. I'm not going to read that now, but in chapter 12, verses 14 through 21, a section that, in my opinion, sounds a lot like Jesus, a lot like the Sermon on the Mount. So Wright says, look, there is a connection between chapter 13, 1 through 7, and what Paul was doing in the previous chapter. Of course, we know there's not chapter demarcations in the actual Greek text or anything like that when it was originally written. These are things to help us have a point of reference. And so clearly for Wright, he says, look, chapter 13 has a connection to people wanting to fight each other in chapter 12. Like, hey, if you're going to fight each other, you need to know that there are structures in place to sort of hold you and kind of like, yeah, you need to watch out for that. But he also notes that state-sanctioned punishment concerns local policing and not national wars. I think that's very significant just to hold. That the punishment is a local kind of punishment for Wright. And often, one of the things I didn't mention, at least not explicitly, Romans 13 has been used to be a text that says, let's go to war. Well, I guess the Nazis. I mentioned the Nazis, so there you go. Okay, another scholar, John Howard Yoder, who I only mention him because of his historic contribution to this passage, but I want to make sure I give you a little note to really just say that I'm compelled to make sure you know that Yoder's interpretation has been helpful, but the truth of the matter is that it came to light that he failed majorly to live his theology as an Anabaptist leader, as a preacher of peace, and he failed miserably with how he, in his private interactions with women, approached them. And there are several victims as a result. And so I only bring him up because others have built on some of his concepts. And so he's in this sort of conversation. But really, I look to voices like Richard B. Hayes and Greg Boyd, who drew heavily on some of his insights, and many others who have taken his work further, and now I think his work is becoming less important. But here's the idea they bring to the table, that chapters 12 and 13 are really important as understanding that the function exercised by government is not the function that Christians should be also exercising, and that wrath in the passage is something that is okay for God, but not for Christians to exercise. So there's some interesting things there, that ultimately the wrath belongs to God, and that the state can use that wrath, but Christians are never to be part of executing the wrath that the state has had delegated to them. I hope that makes sense. Okay. There's another scholar, and by the way, that's a very Anabaptist approach. Like, hey, you want to talk about Romans 13 as a text for violence and for keeping people in line? Well, understand something. Christians don't get to participate in that. I think that's good. I think it's very wise that, from my perspective, Christians that follow this logic wouldn't be police officers. Now, I have friends who are police officers who are also Christian, and I respect our differences, and I actually love these people. So there's a lot of messiness, but we need to be, again, careful to understand, as Wright has highlighted, and now Hayes, Greg Boyd, and the Anabaptist tradition tend to highlight, there is a deep connection between 12 and 13. Another scholar named Robert Jewett portrays this text as inviting a subordination of Christian communities in Rome, highlighting that calling all to this posture, rather than making distinctions between citizens and non-citizens, is a very subversive move in its own right. Now, I think it's hard to kind of capture all of that in a footnote here, or a sort of a blurb for me. But basically understand that for Jewett, the idea that, look, this is the posture all people need to have. And he's saying, look, that involves those who have citizenship in this Roman Empire and those who don't, those who have privilege and those who don't. And that's a subversive thing to say, like, hey, you're all on the same playing field. He also argued that the Greek word, it's a participle that we translate as established or instituted, ought to be translated to emphasize them being ordered into formation by God. In other words, as in military orders, because they are ultimately subject to God. In other words, understand that God is the one who is ultimately in charge. And so this is a subversive text in that it's not saying, hey, they get to do whatever they want. It's watch yourself, because God is the one who's actually in charge here. Watch how you carry out so-called justice. But also, since we happen to be in a system that has these rules, we better watch ourselves too, because there's no reason to go under Rome's sword for personal conflict and various other things, right, that we've already highlighted. And so, again, you could see how all of these scholarly contributions can at some point kind of complement each other and may have nuances and differences. Neil Elliott points out in his book, he has several books, one of which is The Arrogance of Nations, Reading Romans in the Shadow of Empire. Highly recommend this book. And Neil Elliott points to the larger forces that are at work within a domination system like Rome, and that part of Paul's blatant statement about the authority-bearing sword, so to speak, was really there to confront Nero and the Nero-based propaganda that claimed he was this benevolent ruler who would never wield the sword like his predecessors. So Nero comes on the scene as look, I am kind, I'm benevolent, I'm someone you can trust. I'm not like the people before me who were crazy and violent. I am going to be kind of a benefactor to all. And of course, we know Nero ends up having the reputation as being one of the craziest of all. So that, my friends, is important to highlight. Then we go to Mark Nanos, another really interesting contribution. Now, Mark, who is a friend to this show, he's been interviewed multiple times, is someone I really respect. He takes a different approach, quite a radical alternative. And he actually argues that the rulers and authorities in mind here are not Roman, but are the synagogue leaders in the local communities. And so if you have these personal conflicts and these things come up, you need to submit yourself to the rulers and authorities, which are the leaders of the synagogues that you are ultimately subject to, even though you are now followers of Messiah Jesus and are not Jewish in a proper sense. So he's like, look, these Gentiles want to come into this Jewish messianic movement, which is within these synagogue structures. You need to submit yourselves to those structures. There's a lot more to be said about that. Again, I am sort of giving you a quick blurb into several perspectives. And I want to say that each of these has a helpful thing to contribute to the conversation on Romans 13. In a cultural moment like this, and in any cultural moment where we have to ask ourselves, what kind of allegiance are we to have to the government? Now, I want to just kind of build off of that, and hopefully I've given you some thoughts, and I want to sort of set up the context a little bit, and this is where we'll land. Now, I'm not going to tell you exactly my view. I'm not sure that any of these scholars quite captures mine, but I think they're all very helpful. But I can definitely tell you what my view isn't. My view isn't that this is a passage that's like I'm going to say this, and it's because I used to say it before our current president was president, the Trump card, right? Yeah, some of you are like, oh, he's so liberal. No, that's just how I talk. I'm sorry. But you get the idea, right? This passage is not the end all, the Trump card, the sort of like, hey, Romans 13 says we have to fall into line, so just fall into line. So this war is good because it's good for our country, or this thing is the way it is, so just follow along. It's so much more nuanced than that. And so let me give you some reflections that I have written about in the past, and I'm just going to sort of verbalize here. And so here are some thoughts. The logic of Romans 13 is really rooted in a boastful group of Gentiles who are viewing themselves over against Jews in Rome. Okay, so that's a big deal. So there are non-Jews in the community who think themselves to be more important or more valid in their following of Jesus than certain Jews in Rome. And this is why, again, to go back to Neil Elliott's book, he called it the arrogance of nations, because this is one of the core conflicts that has emerged between the two groups. And so Romans is directed at the Gentile followers of Jesus in Rome. And that's really important, as we'll see here as well, because these Gentile followers of Jesus adopted attitudes of superiority. And these looked more like Caesar than Jesus. I mean, that's something we can relate to. So many times, the Christian faith in various expressions looks more like Caesar than Jesus. And Paul's rebuke of this boast is his occasion for writing this letter. And this letter, my friends, is directed at the Gentiles. So, Messianic Jews totally listening in. There's no doubt in my mind about that. There's no doubt that they're there, and it's intentional that they hear this, but they're not having to hear it as recipients of Romans 13 in the sort of it's directed at you sense, but rather this is a letter that is directed at your Gentile brothers and sisters, and something you need to hear as well. And so it was read aloud by Phoebe, but not necessarily directed at them. It was directed at arrogant Gentiles who had taken on imperial characteristics in their ethical attitudes towards their Jewish sisters and brothers. It sounds to me a lot like Privilege 101. So Paul writes with various strategies, various forms of rhetoric and theological explanation. And eventually we get to Romans 13, and we need to ask ourselves, what's going on in the day, right? And we've already said, look, Nero, he was awful, even though he acted like he wasn't. He was awful. And so what do we do with the context of this letter? Well, Paul follows his rebuke of the Gentiles who have biases against their Jewish neighbors, many who are at the time considered less than and may have been dealt really a harsh hand by the Roman government. There's a whole debate about this in scholarship, about whether or not the Jewish community was sent away for a short season, and then finally allowed to return after Claudius had expelled them. So Claudius expels them for some reason, and Nero is like, hey, I'm nice. I'm going to grant you clemency. Come back to the city of Rome as an act of mercy, as a new emperor, kind of like we were talking about earlier. And so there's this sense of like, hey, you come back to town? Okay, you think you're a big deal now? Okay. Well, I don't know what we make of that because it is a debatable matter, but either way, the biased attitudes of superiority toward Jews is pretty clear from the first century sources outside of the New Testament. So we have the sense that whatever the motivation may have been, Gentile followers of Christ are treating their Jewish sisters and brothers as second-class persons. So by the time we get to chapter 8 of Romans, for instance, Paul discusses the need to walk in the Spirit of Christ, to walk in love, and that, the Spirit is groaning, and we ourselves are supposed to groan where the Spirit groans in the world's pain. And he assures them that the day is coming when the whole created order itself is going to be liberated from its bondage to decay. And so in the meanwhile, they can live as more than conquerors. Yeah, more than those fancy soldiers with all of their chariots and swords. You're more than that because not even the invisible forces that empower this evil empire will separate you from the love of God, if you remember chapter 8. And then, of course, chapter 9. Again, I'm assuming some prior knowledge here, so go read Romans. But in chapters 9 through 11, we get this sort of shift that happens in the flow of the letter. We get explicit about the Gentile place in God's plan. This arrogance that they have, arrogance against God's original people, is not only futile, but it's ignorant. Even if non-believing Jewish people in Paul's day were under some sort of discipline from God, a day was coming in the future when all Israel, as it says in this chapter, in a climactic point, all Israel will be saved. And this is talking about the Jewish people, not the church, in my opinion. So Gentiles, where they are, their place in God's plan for salvation is solely because Jesus was faithful. And they needed to remember that they are wild branches being grafted into the Jewish covenant. And thus, the gospel concerns the Jew first and the Gentile after that. That's a big deal. In other words, over and over again, Paul is trying to say, look, your pride has got to be checked. And then, of course, we get into Romans 12, which we've already talked about, which is never usually read in popular context as the flow from which Romans 13 is born. But I think it's really important that we notice what we're looking at when we get to Romans 12. Romans 12 is Paul's vision for what these Gentile Jesus followers in Rome ought to be like. They feed enemies rather than fight with them. They leave room for God's wrath and never take vengeance by their own initiative. They settle matters the way Jesus would, with love, hospitality, and grace. So if the imperial attitudes of arrogance get out of control, what will happen? Well, they'll simultaneously compromise the nonviolent and grace-filled wisdom, or witness, I should say, witness they're supposed to have about the resurrected Jesus, and bring their boast-driven disputes, sadly, out into public. And this is where the rulers and authorities will be ready. If you're going to have these disputes, if you're going to be boast-filled and cause arguments and maybe even sometimes let it lead to blows, oh yeah, guess what? There's an authority in town that's going to take care of that. And they will use the sword to keep order and keep evil at bay. So in Romans 13, we're reminded that Paul's context for saying, let every soul or let everyone be subject to the authorities or the ruling authorities or the rulers and authorities, depending on how you translate it, is the imperial attitudes of the Gentiles' arrogance. That's the context. And this arrogance places their lives under the imperial sword of wrath by acting like the empire, and by not settling disputes with love, by picking fights with their Jewish neighbors. What's going to happen? Rome will have reason to use the sword, which has been delegated to all governing structures by God to push back against evil. That is the purpose of it. Where does authority ultimately lie? Well, in God. In fact, Romans 13:1, in the Greek, it actually says these structures have been put in place by God. And it repeats this phrase, by God, a second time, as to make sure that the point is clear. God is in charge, not Caesar. God is in charge, not the structures. God is in charge. So notice, this authority didn't come as an endorsement of Roman policy or an endorsement of Nero's antics. It was given to this nation and to all nations by God, who holds the nations to account. In other words, we see in Paul, it is the visible and invisible powers that will be judged on the final day when creation is liberated from its bondage. The endorsement is not of policy or practices of the ones who bear the sword as governing authorities. It is a recommendation to the Gentile Christians about how to settle disputes, always with love. And don't worry, Paul, I think, might say, about the governing authorities and rulers. They will have their day in God's courtroom where they will finally realize that they aren't as powerful as they thought, but rather recognize that your conduct must be above reproach, that they will have no reason to use their sword against you. So that's where I think Paul's logic is. And by the way, if they do, they've gone beyond the reach of their God-given place. If you have done nothing wrong and they extend the sword, oh yeah, they have gone beyond. Okay, so I want to leave us with this. Does Paul endorse the Roman Empire as good? This never happens. Nowhere in the New Testament is the Roman Empire praised as being good. Does Paul think that in the overlap between the first and second appearance of Jesus, that these sorts of structures are needed to keep the world in some sort of order? Yes. Oh, very qualified yes. But does this equate Roman laws with being godly and just? Not even a little bit. Should Gentile followers of Jesus in Rome endorse the ways of the Romans? No. However, Paul would say that giving Rome a reason to come against you should never be rooted in arrogance. Rather, if they come against you, which, by the way, this ultimately will happen, and the fire is going to burn, and Jesus followers are going to get blamed for it in Rome in the near future. This letter is right before, a few years before that happens. Here's the deal. When they do come against you, it should expose how evil they are, even as you demonstrate just how good Jesus is by loving neighbors and treating even enemies with kindness. So in summary, Romans 13 is Paul's very practical advice for living in a world where God has given a version of God's authority to the structures, because God does want the world to be ordered in some way, shape, or form to hold evil at bay, even at times when that means the regimes are evil, which I would say all of them are to some extent. But at the end of the day, God says, look, you don't have to worry about the sword coming down on you if you live above reproach. Live well so that if the sword ever comes down on you, it is not because you have lived in a way that is inconsistent with a holy life, but rather because your life is so holy that the powers and principalities don't know what to do with you. That, my friends, is good, practical advice. It is not an endorsement of a whole set of policies or a whole system that is in place. It is be wise, love like Jesus. So when it comes to governmental leaders in the USA quoting Romans 13, or when it comes to us trying to defend our ideas by quoting Romans 13, I just want to say, it's kind of like Paul walking up to Nero and saying, hey, please, can you read this as an endorsement from our God? I mean, that's not Paul's deal. And if you think about it, such a thing is so ludicrous to even imagine. When Paul would later be executed under Nero for breaking the law, so to speak, I highly doubt that Paul would have said, hey, don't worry, friends. I'm getting what I deserve for not following my own advice in Romans 13. I sinned and I broke a law and I must now pay. Come on. Rather, this just shows his Jesus-like conduct was so provocative because it was so much like Jesus as it exposed evil in all its forms and ultimately exposed how Rome was itself evil to execute someone representing God, Jesus, the King of the universe. So I want to kind of leave us with that. I want to make sure that we understand that the ultimate point of Romans 13 comes to us in Romans 13:10. Love does no wrong to neighbor, therefore love is fulfilling of the law. That's it. That's it. So if you have any impulse to bring Romans 13 into conversations about, but then you should stop protesting, then you should stop doing this thing, then you should, let's just stop trying to use Romans 13 like that. Romans 13 has a subversive layer that, look, hey, Rome, you need to know that God is actually in charge. And so you have limits. And if you're going to bear the sword, okay, that's your deal. We get it. That's the way the world is right now. So followers of Jesus, you don't bear the sword because you're better than that. You don't need to use the sword to hurt people. And in fact, if you come under judgment, it's really ultimately probably your fault. And if it's not your fault, then follow the way of Christ like Paul would, right? And so friends, I just want to invite us to think about Romans 13 with grace, with wisdom, and with a bit of context for what the world of Paul was actually like. The Romans 13 that he penned did not apply when that same governing authority structure eventually executed him. We have to read Romans 13 with nuance. We have to handle the scriptures with care. And we have to say, what is the heartbeat of the Bible? And the heartbeat of the Bible is that God is not finished with this world, that God is willing to die at the hands of enemies for this world, that God has resurrected over those enemies, over the powers of this world, over all the governing authorities of this world, because that God is ultimately in charge. And one day this God will return to heal and restore and reconcile. And the role of Christians in the present isn't to say, hey, watch out, you need to be vulnerable to these authorities. You need to be in line. Don't disrupt things. Make things feel comfortable. That's not the role of Christians. The role of Christians is to say, what do we do in a world that is broken and hurting, where folks have experienced deep inequity? What do we do in that kind of world? Well, we say, tell us your story. Let us bring you in. We are not going to be the arrogant ones. We are not going to be like the arrogant disciples of Jesus in Rome who had more privilege than their Jewish neighbors, who had this kind of instinct to take the values of Roman ideology and arrogantly push against their Jewish neighbors. No. We're not going to be that. We're going to say, let's create a table where Jew and Gentile, black and white, every race can come and eat together. But if we're really going to do that hard work, if we're going to do that work well, we have to understand that where there is inequity, where there are advantages for some and not others, the book of Romans says, do not be arrogant. Come under and listen to the stories and the cries of your Jewish neighbors. Do not exclude them. Rather, bring them in and forsake whatever pretense of privilege you have for the sake of creating a table that looks like the end of the world. And what does that end of the world look like? Jew and Gentile, people from every tongue, tribe, and nation worshiping the God of Israel. And so we've got work to do now in anticipation of where this thing is going when Jesus returns to finally set it all back right.
Thanks for listening to Theology Curator. For more resources from Kurt Willems, check out theologycurator.com/newsletter to sign up for our email update list. For new listeners of the podcast, we hope you will subscribe via iTunes, Google, or your podcast manager of choice. If you like what you hear, please leave the show a review. For regular listeners, consider supporting Kurt's online ministry at patreon.com/Kurt Willems. Lastly, please don't let this conversation end when the episode is over. We hope you feel empowered in regular life to explore theology and faith in intelligent and humanizing ways.